In this episode of Monday Moments, we're talking about contentment, so sit back and stay tuned for more. Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Monday Moments, the show in which we take a deeper dive into Sunday's sermon. My name is Travis, your host, with me today is Pastor Jimothy. Sorry, inside joke. Pastor James here with us, and today we are talking about contentment, as I mentioned in our introduction. It's a continuation of our First Things First series, which if you've not had a chance to watch or listen to, you can do so right here on our YouTube channel, on our website, or wherever you get your favorite podcast. And this contentment, I would say, is a continuation of last week's sermon, talking about money, from painting with a broad brush. Really, you could categorize this as stewardship. And I love this principle, I'll say, of contentment. And really looking at the Lord as our provider, and whether He brings much or little. And you referenced that verse from Paul, I have learned the secret of being content in any situation. And it's just such an amazing principle for us to grasp. And not just because we live in one of the most prosperous nations in history. But I think because, when the Bible talks about the fleeting nature of money, it really is true. And so to really grasp and understand this principle of contentment, I feel like is such an amazing, beneficial, valuable, and really, at the end of the day, it's a godly principle to really grasp and to really let it sink in. So I'm really excited to dive into today's discussion. And as you know, I like to start with why, just like my 5-year-old daughter. Why? So talking about contentment, why is contentment important to God? Like, why wouldn't God just say, hey, let me just provide for you all the time, and you never ever face or feel lack in any way, whether it's finances, whether it's relational or whatever the case might be? Why is contentment so critical and important?
So let's go all the way back to the garden. So in the very beginning, everything was provided. And so the critical mistake that we see in the garden was Adam being convinced by the enemy that God was somehow withholding something from him. And so all of a sudden there begins to become this desire to say, well, I deserve what God is withholding. And so thus we enter into original sin. And this just gets extended out through history. I mean, to all the way to today, and it will continue to be this way until as Revelation talks about the new heaven and the new earth, that God comes and remakes all of these things. And so contentment really has everything to do with where do we put our faith? Do we put our faith in my ability to do these things, or do I put my faith in God's ability to give me what I need? And I think there's a big distinction, because when we talk about what do we really need, do we trust God to give us what we need? And in today's day and age, again, we have more expendable income than any society has ever seen or known. And that's not to say that it's not at times still difficult, and that we don't still struggle financially with things, but all of a sudden what we have done is we've taken this whole category of things that we really want, that we feel like we need in our life, but really fall into this category of wants. And we begin to convince ourselves in a little bit of a way that we somehow deserve these things, and that if God really loved me, He would do these things. And unfortunately, what has happened throughout the history, primarily of the Western church, but it happens outside of the United States as well, is that God somehow cares about the same things that we care about, and so it's used to manipulate people. Hey, if you do this, then God is going to give you this, and it's like, no, God's promises that He is going to supply all of my needs according to His riches and glory, and And I don't need I don't always need a new car. I don't always need a bigger house. I don't need all the name brand clothes. But we've relegated God to this cosmic vending machine that as long as we put in the right prayer, or we sow the seed, brother, sow the seed, that we're going to reap a harvest of our own desire out of that. And it just gets perpetuated over and over and over again. And so when it comes to contentment, Paul has that. I have learned to be content, whether in poverty,
right?
So that goes against the prosperity doctrine, name it and claim it, all of these health and happiness kind of stuff. This idea that we could actually be in poverty and be content. But he says, and also in plenty.
Sure.
And I think that's as challenging of a deal, because historically and statistically, when you look, the more people make, the more people want.
Right.
And so there's a secret to being content in all of these things. And Paul finishes it there in verse 19. He says, Philippians 4:19, I have learned the secret to these things, that my God shall supply all of my needs. And I think it really comes down to the definition of, am I content with God supplying me with my needs?
Well, and it really echoes what Jesus taught when, Jesus talked about provision, right? He said, don't worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to wear. And he talked about, Solomon and all of his splendor, the lilies of the field, the birds of the air. God provides for them. And it's so amazing that, Jesus says, the Father knows you need these things. He knows what we need. So don't worry about those things that you need, because, the Father will provide that. And I think it really does, just like you were referencing, the garden. Do we really know God and trust God to be who he said he would be? And unfortunately, the enemy just would love nothing more than to deceive us into thinking God is not really who he said he would be. And that brings up something interesting, because you talked a little bit about there's many of us, and I'm paraphrasing, but there are many of us who are walking around with a beggar mentality instead of the understanding of being a son or a daughter. And referencing your story about Carson having the debit card, you tipped what? But so how does that identity play into things? And I love, and we had someone ask us, how does giving tie into this whole series of discipleship? And one of the things that I, in that conversation mentioned is going all the way back to the first message that you gave in the series, which was knowing God, knowing the builder. And if you don't know God, it can be really hard to trust him. It can be really hard to trust him. And there's kind of, being a foster parent, our oldest daughter's adopted, we saw that a lot, that kind of orphan mentality of, I don't know where my next meal is going to come from. I don't know if my basic needs are going to be provided. So can you talk a little bit more about how that mentality of a beggar, or that orphan mentality comes into play in all this?
So, had some friends who adopted. They adopted a child that was a little bit older, and there was always insecurity in their home growing up, and this before they adopted this one. And so he said, I noticed that the first couple of months that they were there, this little child that they had adopted would hide food in their pockets and their clothes, and they were always hoarding it. And if they could find some things, they would kind of hide those things in their room. And he says it got to be one of these deals where we felt like we were constantly addressing it, but the problem is that we weren't really addressing the root of the problem. And the root of the problem was that there was this fear that always said there wasn't going to be enough, because that had been their experience. And he says it required us to continue to reiterate to this one, we are always going to take care of you. We're always going to make sure that you have food to eat and that you have clothes to wear. And he says it took a long time, but we were eventually able to work through this underlying fear. And I think that the beggar mentality comes from this fear that God is not faithful.
Right.
And it really challenges us to put him to the test, because we're never going to understand the faithfulness of God if we don't give him an opportunity to be faithful.
Exactly.
And so for, I told the story about Carson, but for my kids, not perfect. I have failed them on too many occasions to count. But my goal, even as an earthly father, has been to be faithful to my word, to be faithful to my provision. And so they have grown up now. My daughter went and did something special. My daughter in college went and did something special with her friends the other day, and she called me and she said, Daddy, can I have a little bit of money to go and do this? Now, she knows that I love her, and she knows that if I have the provision, I want to be able to provide for her. And so there was a confidence. She didn't call begging. She didn't call, fearful. She called going, I know that my daddy loves me, and that if he has the capacity, he wants to help me. And so moving from a beggar mentality to a son and a daughter mentality has everything to do with how we relate to God. And it goes back to his word. Good. Like, I'm going to relate to God based upon what I know about God.
Yep.
And if I don't know the true God, if I only know the image that other people have given to me, and if that image is off even just a little bit, and here's the thing, it can be off both ways.
Sure.
It can be off in the way that says, look, if you have always been told that whatever you ask of God, as long as you ask of it in his name, he's going to give it to you, guess what? God is going to appear to be unfaithful to you.
Right.
If you have been taught growing up that God is to be feared, not in the biblical fear standpoint, but if he's this scary guy that he's just out there to judge you, he's about to do all of these different things, and it doesn't matter what you need, he's not going to respond, then God is going to represent someone who's unfaithful to you.
Yeah.
But if you have a complete picture of who God says that he is in his word, and he talks about being a good father, he talks about being one who supplies our need, he talks about one who's overcome already the challenges, then what you are going to experience is you are going to experience the faithfulness of the God of the Bible, not the God of society, not the God that has been presented, which is, maybe true, maybe not true.
Sure.
But the God according to his word, he will not fail his word.
Right.
And in order to do that, we have to not just know him, we have to be willing to trust in him.
Yeah.
In areas that he would prove his faithfulness. And the more that we do that, it's like giving. The more that we get confident in our giving, because if he's leading us to it, he's gonna provide for us. And again, this is not a exchange your 10 for 100 kind of a deal. It's just, but to say, look, Lord, if you're leading me to it, you're providing for it. Yep. And the more that we do that, and the more that we see the blessing that comes, it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. He will care for us. He will take care of us. He will multiply these things. All of these things that we see in his word. The more that we do that, the greater the faith that we have in him, the more confidence that we have in him as a father, and the more content we are in what he provides us for. So
well, and I loved in your message, you kind of mentioned that, like, don't let your misunderstanding keep you from this principle.
Yes.
Don't let it keep you from giving, even if you've got pain, if you've got misunderstanding, if you've got questions, if you've got fears, if you've got doubts, whatever the case might be, talk to God about it.
Yeah.
And what an amazing, I think that is just such one of the clearest ways I can think of to say how amazing is our God.
Yeah.
That we can go to him with these struggles that we're having and have a conversation about it. Now, we can still be obedient and say, God, I don't understand this. This is hard. This is scary, whatever the case might be, but talk to him about that.
Yeah.
Our God is so faithful and so open that we can still come boldly before that throne to receive grace and mercy in that time of need. And it's just one of such an amazing aspect of God's character. And just like you were saying, it's that opportunity for a loving father to prove who he said he was going to be. Transitioning a little bit, we could talk about that so long because there's so many good things about that. But when you talk about living contently, how do we do that practically? What does that look like on a daily basis, or a weekly basis, or monthly basis, or whatever? How do we live contently? What does that practically look like? How does that play out? beyond, right, like we're talking about the principle of contentment, and we can read Paul's words and say, yep, I agree, that's a great statement. Okay, well, how do I actually do that? What's does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there's a lot of nuance to that to that question. How do we live contently? Because I think that I think it's situational at times. I mean, not everyone is in the same situation, and so it's easy at times to just go ahead and give a blanket statement to things,
right?
Not recognizing that there's a lot of things that are going on
in that way.
And I don't even think it's so much gray as I think it can be black and white, but I think it can be black and white situationally.
Well, and you talked about grace being a part of this, being a part of this process.
Yeah. And so to begin to take steps towards contentment, I am much more content now than I was 10 years ago.
Sure.
I am much more confident now than I was 10 years ago, and I think that the process towards contentment is coming to this place of a constant reminder of ultimately He owns everything, and I am a steward of these things. Now, again, I do not. I don't think that God wants us to live in poverty.
Sure.
I don't think that's what being content is. I don't think that we have to take a vow of poverty and we have to divulge ourselves of or divest ourselves of all of our earthly possessions and live in a tent. And I heard one guy say, he's like, in the beginning of my marriage, I really felt like I've got to divest myself from all these things. And so he says, I slept on the floor because I considered a mattress a luxury.
Wow.
And he's like, the Lord has dealt with me a lot in that area.
Yeah.
But again, I think that contentment can look different for different people.
Yeah.
Because I think that there's in every one of our lives, I would say that if we sat down and looked at it, there's probably areas of your life that you're more content than I am. That I struggle with my contentment in that way. And there's probably areas in my life that I'm more content in certain things than you are. And I think that it comes back to, if we go back a couple of weeks and we talk about worship, like, what do we elevate?
Yeah.
What does it look like to be content? Because personally, I'm not a real possessions guy. Like possessions don't really do it for me. I like nice stuff.
Sure.
I like to have it. But if everything in my life like burned up and disappeared, I'm like, I can get more stuff.
Yeah.
Like it just doesn't. I'm not super sentimental in that regard, and so possessions are not necessarily that thing for me. But there's other areas that the Lord is still. He still challenges me.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to contentment, I think, like, what are the things that I elevate in my life?
Yeah.
And Lord, am I content with what you've given me? Or do I find my thoughts, my time, and my efforts consumed by gaining more?
Right.
Now, what I could find is that if I shift those things, the Lord may actually give me those things.
Sure. Yeah.
But the question is not one of, do I have nice things or things like that? The question is, Lord, am I content with what you've done in me? Or do I find myself striving continually in these different areas in order to change that?
Well, and you mentioned that quote from Tim Keller. You know, it's amazing how
your money follows whatever its God is.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that, as we were kind of discussing as a staff, that quote, it's amazing how freely our money flows to that which we love.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good starting point, is to really, even like you just pointed to, is what are our thoughts and the longings of our heart constantly being drawn to or driven to and consumed by?
I think it is as simple as this. There are most people, if you would ask people if they have a desire to be generous, I think that the majority of people would say, I'd like to be generous. I wish I was more generous. Yeah. I wish that I had more opportunities to do these things. But here's the litmus test. Like, let's sit down. And I joke all the time. My girls, occasionally, one of my daughters, when either my one is in town or my one on the way to school, she's like, Daddy, will you take me by to get get a drink from On the Grind or whatever.
Yeah.
It's like $7.
I know.
and there's people that I look at and I'm like, you do this every day.
Every day.
I mean, 7 times 3, yeah, $210 a month. And again, I'm not against it.
Sure.
But if that is preventing you from being generous, what is it that you really value?
Yeah.
I'm not attacking your call. I'm kind of, but at the same, I mean, it's just the little things,
right?
And so if my ultimate goal, if my highest goal, is to, Lord, I want to be more generous, then I have to begin to value the things that are preventing me from generosity.
Yeah.
And I think that we would all be a little surprised. I mean, we try to sit down in our own home and we try to evaluate where our spending is going,
right? Because
we want to continue to be more generous.
Right.
We already have it as a principle, generosity in our home, and so whenever we can say yes to something, we try to say yes, that, hey, we want to invest in that. We want to be a part of that. We want to bless this person. We want to do these different things. But our goal is to be more generous. Mm-hmm. And so we're always evaluating those things.
Right.
Like, are we spending too much of our maybe our discretionary money in this place? And is it preventing us from doing what we feel like the Lord wants us to do?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you talked about those, I think it was 5 principles of disciples when it comes to being generous and giving. And, you know, I loved some of the things they give regularly, they give spontaneously. Yeah. And so I want to piggyback off of that just a little bit. And I know we've got to wrap things up here pretty quick, but and this is going to be very, very specific, but very, very practical. What are some ways, if somebody's listening to your message or maybe to this, and they say, I want to start making margin in my life to be ready to be generous, right? Now, whether that is we take up special offerings from time to time, whether that is, you know, hey, I want to buy someone's lunch, the person behind me, I want to pay for their lunch, or just a regularly increasing, whatever the case might be. What are some practical ways that someone can walk away from yesterday's message, this conversation, and say, I want to start making margins in this? Is it something like a Dave Ramsey course? Is it something like a budgeting app? And I realize that this is very, very practical, very, very specific. But how would you encourage someone that says, I want to make more margin, be more generous? What do I do?
So super practical. And again, when we talk about the tithe is a unit of measurement. It meant the tenth, and so it becomes a kind of a guideline, a principle. The tithe is a principle. We're not under the law. You know, I don't want to have to rehash all of that. But I think that the way that most people look at their giving is they do everything that they want to do, they do everything that they're committed to, and then they look and see what's left over. Mm-hmm. Here would be my first challenge to you. Take what you have and remove the first 10%.
Yeah.
Give that first.
Yeah.
And then look at your budget and figure out from the rest of your budget where you can make cuts.
Right. Yeah.
Because again, if I came to you, and I'm not going to, by the way, I just as you know, and said, I'm going to reduce your income by 10%.
Yeah.
Would your family survive?
Yeah.
Would you find a way to make it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it becomes a matter of what's most important.
Right.
And again, this is not law, but if someone was saying, how would I do this? I would say I would start with the 10%. Mm-hmm. Like I would just, my budget would start with that, and then I would figure out everything below that. Yep. And maybe, you know, and again, my wife and I, we have been doing this. Kelly is great with our budget. She's so good with our finances and has just been so diligent in that way. I'm so blessed in that way. Yeah. But over the years, again, we kind of started there, but by God's grace, we have looked at that because our desire is to continually be more generous. Our desire has been to increase that. So we have been able to do that over the years. But then beyond that regular giving, it's like, okay, well, we also want to make sure that we have margin for generosity. We want to have margin for these certain things. And so we constantly look at that, and we start with that number. We say, well, we want to be able to say that we can be generous with this amount of money a month. And so we put that at the top of our budget. And say, okay, this portion is unavailable. We have this portion remaining to do everything else.
Yep.
To pay our bills, to do all of this. And so what you then begin to find is it's like, oh, wait a second. When I do this first, my tithes, my offering, my generosity, when I put that column at the top, I suddenly figure out how to do everything else below that. Now, I said yesterday, and again, no condemnation. You may be in a position where financially there's been some mistakes, or there was just a lack of education early on, and you kind of find yourself in this place. Here's what I would do. I would encourage you to begin in those same ways, and to work those things out. And if those things are not working out, then really begin to take those things before the Lord and ask the Lord, what would you have for me? If this is the place that I'm hoping to get to, how do I begin to make steps now? And I think that the best way to do that is to begin to make regular investments into the kingdom of God. Yeah. Regular investments. And if you're listening to this and you're not a part of Freedom Fellowship Church, you're part of another church somewhere else, I want to say first and foremost, please don't invest in Freedom Fellowship. Invest in where you're being fed. Yeah. Like that is so critical that we're going to serve at the table that we feed. Yeah. And so if you're a member of Freedom Fellowship, thank you so much. But if you're watching this and you're a member of another church, man, invest in your local church. Like, be a part of what they are doing. It's such a rewarding thing. But make a plan in your own heart to say, we're gonna begin to walk these things out. Yeah. Well, thank you. Part of the reason I asked that is because I'm kind of fall into that category where I am not great with numbers. You know, I'm the creative arts director because I like colors and shapes. Okay, I don't do the numbers. So I was very blessed by my wife. Office is full of Play-Doh and and balloons, so. And glue and markers and things. But I find that practical steps like that can be very helpful. So I know we're basically out of time. Thank you for taking some time to dive into this really somewhat challenging but extremely beneficial topic, principle of contentment. And thank you for joining us for another episode of Monday Moments. We hope that you got something out of this. If you did, please share that with us however you can, because we always love to hear feedback. As always, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Monday Moments, and we will see you next week.